In this guide, we'll be going over 6 tips that can really improve your general performance as a ranged physical damage dealer, or DPS, job in Final Fantasy XIV. Naturally, these tips will be generally helpful for all ranged physical DPS jobs, and so may include job-specific examples but will be applicable to all or most ranged physical jobs. Let's start with the first tip on how to deal with pulls in a dungeon. As a ranged physical DPS, nearly all of your area of effect or AoE attacks are instant, allowing you to strafe alongside the enemies and hit them while the tank is pulling. Now, while that gives you a lot of freedom to lay a lot of damage onto the enemies while the tank is pulling, ranged physical jobs are not nearly as good at dealing with potentially unwanted attention as, say, a melee DPS is. For this reason, it is relatively important that you keep a close eye on how much enmity you are generating, as you would rather not grab the attention of anything while you are attacking. As you attack, pay close attention to the gems in the enemy list. A green gem indicates that someone else, the tank hopefully, has a significant lead of enmity over you, making them safe to attack. Usually. As you grow closer to grabbing aggro, the gem gradually turns red. First, it will turn yellow, indicating that you have over 50% of the enmity of the tank. Then it will turn orange, which indicates that you are extremely close in enmity to the tank. The likely scenario is that if you do anything more to this enemy, you will get aggro and you should stop now. When the gem is red, it of course indicates that you are the attack target. What you need to do is pay very close attention to how much the tank actually did to the enemies. Because if they hardly did anything, then being over 50% of their enmity, yellow gem, can sometimes mean you are still just one attack away. Naturally, getting aggro isn't equal to instant death, but it is far scarier than if you were a melee DPS. If you reach the point where any more attacks will give you aggro, you can simply stop attacking and make your way up to the tank so you are ready to continue attacking once the tank starts AoEing again. If you do end up in the unfortunate scenario of getting aggro, your aim should be to make your way to the tank to make it as easy for them as possible to get back the aggro of the enemies you pulled off of them. Using tools like slows and snares will only make this problem take longer to resolve, so I would recommend using any mobility options you do have to get a lead and then just run to the tank, rather than crowd control the enemies. Take note that you sometimes will have to run just past the tank to get the enemies properly close to the tank. The second tip is about positioning as a ranged physical DPS. The entire ranged physical role has only a single casted or channeled niche action to share amongst them. That is to say, you can effectively do everything your job needs to do while running. Now combine that with exceptional range on your attacks and you can be anywhere in a boss fight you want to be. Now, one thing is being able to run laps around the outer edge of a boss arena while doing your rotation, and another is whether that is actually a good idea, as most jobs have max range limits on their AoE options, healing or raid buffs. The further away you are from your team, the less likely you are to benefit from either of these. And in the case of Bard and Dancer, the less likely your raid is to benefit from your buffs. For all these reasons, whenever you are far away from your attack target, you should always ask yourself why that is. If you have no good reason to be far away, come closer. The best place to cast your own raid buffs is from under the boss, as it maximizes the chance that your tank, which tends to be further away than the rest of the raid, as well as everyone else, benefits from your buffs. The best place to hang out when you have no particular reason to be anywhere specific is to hang out close to your healers, as that means they have an easier time healing you and keeping you alive. The third tip is about 2 of your utility role actions, Head Grace and Peloton to be specific. Let's start with the easier of the 2, Peloton, as it increases yours and your party's move speed while out of combat, and all it costs you is simply pressing the button regularly. Make sure you always do so. When in a dungeon, you can make the run progress faster by just using Peloton when it is available. And you can make it safer too by running back to make sure whoever's furthest behind also gets the speed boost so they don't fall far behind. Head Grace, on the other hand, is more complicated. Now, normally you might think that the only way to prevent a spell from an enemy is to stun them mid-cast, and you would be right. right up until enemies start being immune to stuns. On the other hand, certain spells can specifically be interrupted, and these are indicated by a red, pulsing and blinking cast bar, in contrast to the usual orange and still cast bar. In nearly every situation you will ever run into involving interruptible actions, interrupting is better than not interrupting, and the only exceptions tend to be related to a follow-up action that is more important to interrupt. Only tanks and ranged physical jobs have access to interrupts. So in these cases, the reasoning for saving an interrupt for specifically the most important spell the enemy has that can be interrupted is because of the possibility that you both interrupt the first spell, and so don't have access to an interrupt for the more important action. A concrete example is the fleshless captive, the Wraith, just before the final boss in the Siren Song C, who will cast an interruptible but avoidable AoE called Dark, followed up shortly after by the equally interruptible Seductive Scream, which is an unavoidable charm that causes your character to walk up to the monster for several seconds, during which it will cast Flood, and also interruptible Circle AoE that you will not be able to avoid if you are charmed. Granted, the fleshless captive can also be stunned, allowing a tank to deal with Seductive Scream anyway if they so desire. However, as you, the ranged physical job, only have one chance to stop it, you should save your interrupt for the most threatening Seductive Scream. This is just a particular example, however, and if you don't know, then it is always better to interrupt something than nothing. Even if you interrupt Dark, it is better than interrupting nothing at all. Always use your interrupt if you have an opportunity to do so, and if you want to be especially good about it, delay your interrupt until the very last moment before the spell hits. Although, sometimes it is better to use the interrupt quickly so other potential interrupters don't accidentally use theirs as well. The fourth tip is survival and utility in general. All ranged physical DPS jobs have access to some limited defense options, some better than others, but you still need to actively use them to get value out of them. If you took a lot of punishment separate from raid-wide damage, meaning your health is significantly lower than your team, making use of personal healing actions like Second Wind or the Dancer's Curing Waltz can help save resources for your healers, as otherwise they may have to cast heals specifically for you, which we don't want if we can avoid it. In fact, making smart use of Dancer's improvisation can help healers after raid-wide damage too. So, knowing how to get the most out of the tools you have is important. When a raid-wide attack is being cast, consider using your ranged physical job specific raid-wide damage reduction. While each one has a distinctly different one, they all work exactly the same, have the same effect, duration and cooldown, and don't stack. For Bard specifically, Nature's Min uniquely allows you to heavily boost the healing an individual receives. While you can use it on yourself alongside Second Wind to boost this in a tough spot, the most effective time to use it is for the tank while they are taking heavy damage, such as in large AoE pools in dungeons. Additionally, Bard uniquely also is able to remove one removable debuff every 45 seconds with Warden's Pair. So, knowing how to identify these kinds of debuffs and, more importantly, which ones are more dangerous and who to help first makes a huge difference. For example, a debuff that increases damage taken, applied specifically on the tank, tends to be a lot more brutal than if placed on a damage dealer, and paralysis on a healer or a mage is much more disruptive than on a tank, a melee DPS, or even yourself. In fact, helping the healer get rid of said paralysis first may help them find time to help everyone else faster. You can identify a removable debuff by a bluish-white line over the debuff itself, and unless you know a more important debuff is coming up shortly, it is always better to use Warden's Paeon than not. In fact, using the ability applies a buff for 30 seconds that intercepts the first debuff applied to the player, so sometimes just throwing it out there can also be helpful. The fifth tip is about timing your burst every 2 minutes. If you are a Savage Raider, this is probably completely obvious, and you always do this by planning with your static or even with randoms due to how set in stone optimized rotations can be. However, if you're doing non-Savage content, it is not unusual for people to die mid-fight, getting their cooldowns offset from their 2-minute timer. Some players also simply don't care or do their own thing, which also offsets the timer. due to Dancer and Bard themselves being jobs that significantly impact other players' DPS by having strong raid cooldowns on 2-minute timers. It is important for your mastery of these jobs to be able to somewhat consistently use your 2-minute cooldowns on time correctly. And of course making the most of them yourself, making learning the generally optimized openers for these jobs extremely important for your mastery. For machinists on the other hand, you have no raid cooldowns to speak of, but you do have a big attack that has some leeway in terms of timing, namely your battery gauge and automaton queen. So learning which raid cooldowns are available in your party or raid composition can be extremely helpful. Also, paying attention to whether other players in your party are using their raid cooldowns reliably can more easily let you plan your burst. Is there a point in stockpiling battery gauge for big cooldowns, or should I just use it the moment I see a single raid buff on myself? These kinds of considerations can improve your DPS in less coordinated teams. Naturally, mastering the optimal opener and burst for any job is extremely helpful, and so this tip is mainly intended to point out that in certain content, being able to adapt your rotation a bit can be more beneficial, especially for a selfish DPS job like Machinist. The sixth and final tip is about the limit break. Now, just to be sure, let me explain what it is first. The limit break is a gauge that becomes available in group content, and it is a shared gauge, meaning that if any one person uses it, the entire party loses it. As such, it is important for the entire party to use it correctly. In a 4-player party, you have access to Limit Break 1 and unlock Limit Break 2 on the final boss of a dungeon. In 8 or more player content, you get access to Limit Break 3. Depending on what role you are, the Limit Break does something different. Tanks apply a raid-wide damage reduction effect, and the higher limit break stage, the greater it is. In most situations, the tank limit break is only needed for attacks that will wipe the raid specifically if you don't use the tank limit break. So typically, you know when this happens. The healer limit break heals the entire raid for a gradually increasing amount, with Limit Break 3 fully healing everyone, maxing out their MP and also raising everyone from the dead without applying the weakness debuff normally applied by raising spells. Melee DPS Limit Break is an increasingly powerful single target attack, meaning that in most boss fights it is expected that they use the Limit Break. However, with 2 or more targets, the mage, and more importantly for you, the Ranged Physical Limit Break becomes superior. The Mage Limit Break is an increasingly powerful point-and-click placed circle AoE, and the Ranged Physical is an increasingly powerful line AoE. Both of these do the exact same damage, but they specifically do enough damage to beat the melee limit break on 2 or more targets. In a dungeon context, it is considered more time efficient to use an AoE limit break on the final pack before the final boss of a dungeon, in comparison to trying to get a limit break 2 on the final boss, who often will be dead or near dead by that point anyway. For raid bosses on the other hand, unless the fight has more than one target, the AoE limit breaks are usually only used in the event that the melee DPS simply don't bother using theirs. An additional thing to keep in mind about the limit break in these cases is that you don't have to make use of a limit break the moment it is available, especially with Limit Break 3. While a melee Limit Break 3 does tremendous amounts of damage, in a bad spot, a healer's Limit Break 3 can save a losing battle. But if you already used the Limit Break, then you lose this possibility. For this reason, it is worth it to wait with using a Limit Break 3 until you know that it is safe to do so, that you know the healers will not need it. As such, if your party has shown to be likely to die randomly or have issues with a specific mechanic, then choosing to wait with using the limit break, yes, even as a ranged physical, until after that happens to make sure it is safe to use is what makes the difference between a great and an exceptional player. The latest you should wait with using an attack limit break should not be much later than when the boss is below 10% HP. If you wait much longer than this, then you may end up wasting some of the limit break damage, and the cast time is too long to waste it to use as a glorified execution move. But do try to make sure the melee DPS gets plenty of opportunity to use it first, as their limit break is stronger for single target fights. Thank you for watching. I hope you find some of these tips helpful or at least interesting, and if you did, consider liking the video. You can also subscribe or tip the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you have any questions or anything you would like to add, like a tip of your own, please leave a comment. And finally, if you would like to support me and the channel even more, consider becoming a member. Fun fact, from a Realm Reborn to Stormblood, some jobs applied debuffs that increased certain damage types. Bard, Machinist and Dragoon did piercing damage, but only Dragoon applied the piercing increasing debuff. Due to the party bonus demanding a ranged physical for optimal groups, this led to optimized groups being forced to bring a Dragoon, lest their ranged physical would underperform.